Isn't it funny how in life, on the outside, it appears that people have it all.
Yeah.
And and when I think that is, it seems like maybe they have the life that a lot of us are chasing, whether we should or we shouldn't. And then you look at someone that's there and everything in the side of them can't even have any perception on how good life is, the situation they're in, the freedom they have. That might be the whole paradox that all of us are trying to unlock with this entire experience.
I had probably a really interesting, valuable experience when I was pretty young. I was 24, 25 years old, and through a series of it's an interesting story, but I ended up being the executive vice president for a large company that was owned by a family, mom, dad, two sons. So, I'm 24, the son's 30 and 32, and we're running an $800 million company. And that is where I saw or learned that, he could go buy a Ferrari on a whim, but they were so unhappy. And, the vivid memory, we're in Scottsdale, staying at this beautiful resort. We're in the spa in the hot tub waiting for a massage. And he is just going on and on and on about how he's upset because his brother did not ever thank him for the housewarming gift that he had bought. It was a $60,000 statue that he bought. I was with him when he bought it. He bought it like, we would buy a pair of socks. And I'm finding myself having this conversation about family, money, priorities, and I could see the wheels spinning. And right, how did this guy get to this stage of life and not ever have had this conversation? So, yeah. And to the outside world, they had it all, and they were so unhappy.
What do you think we do with it if so few people obtain multi-millionaire status, even fewer obtain billionaire status? What do you think? When I say, the reason why I say the average person, I'm talking about average income, average career, 2 kids, a married couple if they're traditional, 2 kids, normal college experience or not, just middle America. What does 60 or 70 or 80% of society, what should we do with this conversation that we've just had here for 3, 4, 5 minutes?
I think it really comes back to understanding what you really want to accomplish in life. How do you measure success? Another experience many years ago, I was on a flight. I don't even remember where we're going anymore. Coming back, I'd been upgraded into first class because I was flying a lot, and I sit down next to this guy, and he's got the Rolex, and, he was probably about my age now. And we didn't say a word to each other the entire flight. We're both working away. We get up, he's standing in front of me, we're getting our luggage down, and he turns around and he's got tears in his eyes. And he looks at me and he says, "Be careful about which wall you lean your ladder against." And he turned around and he walked away. And I thought about that a lot over the years, but that is what we're talking about. And what matters? What do we spend our time against? I have a lot of friends that have been very successful in different ways. I got lucky early on. As a young CEO, as part of a CEO group, it's Vistage now. It was tech back then. And, in my group, Peter Coors, Steve Ells, the founder of Chipotle, some very successful people. And the rest were as accomplished, but, we wouldn't recognize their names. But one of them, he owned an island. And he he talked with me a lot. He was a good mentor, and he talked about how do you raise your children in wealth and not ruin them. And so I think kind of this accumulation of these different, experiences, and everybody has different beliefs and faith and everything else. But what master do you serve? And where do you put your time and your energy, and what is this balance? These are things I end up talking with people a lot about, because when we start really exploring a business, or very often it's not just, am I going to become a franchise owner? They're at this inflection point. What am I going to do next? And I kind of take them back to the beginning of, all right, let's define how you're going to measure any potential opportunity, whether it's taking another job, buying a business, starting, and I think only through that lens can people truly get, to your point, to the place in life where they really want to be. It's got to be intentional. We kind of wander through lives and let life happen to us instead of taking charge of it. And I think that's how, somebody that's 32 years old with a Ferrari and a Porsche and a mansion and everything else is miserable. He didn't have a plan.
Yeah. So does intentionality, if that whole conversation is you got to be intentional. And I think you tie that together with, it's almost like, what do you want? That's what we're talking about, right? Have intentionality on reverse engineering or the necessary tactical action steps you need to make to have the best shot to obtain what you want. And I'm not talking about just material things. It's a part of it. I'm not talking about just financial independence. It's a part of it. I'm not talking about just a family and what you want that to do. It's part of it. I think we're talking about intentionality on these 3 or 4 or 5 really big pillars in life that are probably going to decide when we get to the end. And if we have a moment to look back instead of a momentary death, if we have a moment to look back to say, was that a life well lived?
Yep. I think that really is it. Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. And we can take that in small snippets, whether it's a career or a business, but more importantly, our life.
Great conversation to kick this off. They don't even know who he is yet, you all. His name's Scott Jones. I'm pumped about having a conversation today. You're in the franchising world, but there's so much. We could probably sit here and talk for 3 or 4 or 5 hours about just the beginnings of being a franchise owner, being a franchisee, a franchisor, what type of wife it is. Should you do that versus standing up your own? What type of planning should there be? What are the expected ROI? I mean, I'm imagining a counseling session sometimes goes 8 or 9 or 10 deep, and then sometimes you're like, you got to make a decision.
Exactly. And how is that decision framed? How is that decision measured? And that is that intentionality.
So you've been in this franchise space. You've been here for, I believe, 30 years. But if you go all the way back to when you were a young executive at 24, a lot of people say, how'd you get here? That's not necessarily the question I have, but it's like, what along the path? Because at any moment, I know a lot of people that go to law school and then they're like, I don't want to be an attorney. So they don't do that. There's people sometimes that get through 3 years of medical school and they're like, you know what? I spent a lot of money and a lot of time, but this process has shown me I don't want to do that. So you could have at any of these moments, you didn't have to stay for 30 years in this space, but what led you here? Not the full experience and what happened to you at 7 years old and, the first time we got fired and how that was, not all that, but what led you here to this? And then what do you find within it? So it's like, yeah, give us a sales pitch, but really the purpose on why do you like being in this space so much of people franchising? And what do you like most about it? Like, why do you do this?
I love entrepreneurship. I grew up, not going to take you back to 7 years old, but I grew up in an entrepreneurial home. And I watched my dad build businesses. I saw the rewards of that. I saw the challenge and the worry, and I was exposed to a lot of that just at a very young age. I didn't ever have a job. until coming out of college. I always had created my own businesses. And my first job, I'm in Dallas. I set 2 records in the same week, highest, single job. And it comes time for my review, and I get just a really great attaboy and a $400 bonus. And it was at that moment where I realized, okay, I don't want to have somebody else that is in control of what I can make, when I work, who I work with, who my customers are. And that's where I really started in earnest this journey of who am I going to be from the professional perspective. And I've opened up a number of businesses. Some are franchises, some were not. It was really, what's the right business right now? So it did come back to what we're talking about. It was a very intentional choice. And what has kept me in it is I really enjoy the process of opening businesses. That strategic part, the challenge, I enjoy that more than the late stage. I like to build people. I like to build teams. And so that is really the thing that I enjoy. This allows me to do it. And now working with many others, I get to live vicariously, every day helping people chart this course. So it's a great thing when you love what you do.
Have you been doing this long enough where you have a good gut feeling when you first talk to people what they should do?
In terms of the specific business, that takes 3 or 4 weeks before I've got a pretty good beat on that. But I know usually within 15, 20 minutes of talking with somebody if they've got the right mix of capabilities, their background, they've got the financial capacity, history leaves clues. And so I'm looking at them through the lens of a franchisor. I've been a franchisee. I've been a franchisor. I've been a supplier at scale. And so I've seen what separates franchisees, business owners that really thrive, and those that just survive or don't make it. So I can usually tell pretty quickly.
Is it easy to talk about now what those attributes are and some of the experiences, or does it take sitting down and looking at the person and say, oh, they don't have that? Or could you lay them out here without putting you on the spot? Like, these are 3 or 4 of the things over your few decades that you're like, man, if you don't have these, it's not that you can't, but it's going to be really tough for you because it's already hard enough, right? In this competitive market inside capitalism, it's already, because we're competing every day. Is there this finite things, or is it almost like we're trying to figure out if the person has it? And all the big leaders I talk to, it's tough for us to define it every time. You just know when you see it, and you know when they don't have it.
I think that a big part of it is the personality where you own what happens. Life doesn't happen to us. We make things happen. And when something goes right, we celebrate it and we move on. When something unexpected happens, or we run into, a roadblock, a hurdle, we attack it head on. Sometimes we bust through it. Sometimes we have to chip away. But it's that emotional perseverance that I believe really does separate the people that are really strong business operators, business owners, from those that are not. Franchising, it's entrepreneurship with guardrails. I don't have to create the plan. I have to execute upon it. I get all kinds of different backgrounds, personalities. That's all fine. An engineer, very different than a VP of sales. They've got different backgrounds, different skill sets. And so does that mean that, an engineer is going to be better or worse than a VP of sales or a CEO? No. It's getting them into the appropriate business where they can leverage their skills. But when you strip all of that away, it still comes down to, it's 2:00 in the morning and I had a rough day. Tomorrow the sun's going to come up and I attack the day again. That mentality, grit, whatever we want to call it, as a franchisor, that's what I was looking for. And as I'm having conversations with potential franchisees and a good franchise, they're evaluating you as closely as you're evaluating them. Is it a good fit? Is it a good partnership? And it's that intangible that often outweighs the years of, I've led a team of 1,000. How are you going to react?
Yeah. And there's not 8 different departments that when something happens, you can put it in one of those categories and they take care of it.
And that's something we talk about because, I've got an assistant that has an assistant, and then all of a sudden, it's me at the beginning. And part of that, I work with people that have a smaller net worth and ultra high net worth. So some of this is just the resources that are available. But, let's take somebody that's never been in a business or, an executive, but they are accustomed to having a really well-trained, accomplished staff. And how do you manage maybe they're blue collar. We've got some sort of a service oriented business. And instead of making, $150,000 a year, they're making $28, $30 an hour. Can you manage them the same way? In a lot of the respect, I think leaders are leaders. They know how to build culture, to build team. And those are some of the things that I'm looking for, because as we're trying to determine out of these 4,000 different franchise brands, which are the few that make the short list that we should be evaluating, these are some of the pieces that I'm looking at. What are their skill sets? But particularly for somebody that is in a job and they want to stay in that job, or they need to stay in that job for some period of time. Quite often, they're looking at a franchise as an off-ramp out of corporate somewhere downstream. Well, in that scenario, the most important skill set that they need to bring to the table is the ability to lead, because they're building that manager. They're really making sure that they're delivering on the promise, whatever they're selling, the service or the product. Their team, his team, her team is doing an exceptional job. So that really allows a lot of different types of backgrounds, personalities to come in. But at the core, that determination, that perseverance has to be there, or they struggle.
You talked about in your seat evaluating franchisors, because you're in the business of, you're almost a consultant. You're in the business of putting people together, right? And, we all get fees. We're all selling something, right? But I'm assuming you're like, I want to sell franchises for the best franchisors. And so let's not talk about industry specific. Let's not talk about segment. And obviously none of the people that you're representing or not are selling franchises for. But what have you seen? Because so often we talk about what employees need to do better. We don't talk enough about what do the leaders need to do better. So when you're looking for the franchisor, what are you looking for in that group of people that are operating the business that give the franchisee the best chance to succeed?
It's such a great question. And I think it is one that is too often overlooked. People get enamored by the widget. They're a consumer. They think, therefore, it's a great business. Not always. Everybody that I work with, I tell them the most important decision they'll make is who their franchise partner is, the franchisor. So the leadership team of the franchise, first, they need to understand what franchising is. Franchising is not making a sandwich or mowing a lawn or putting on a roof. Franchises are in the royalty business. And being in the royalty business, there's great alignment. They need to drive top line revenue for that franchisee because that's what the royalty is typically calculated off of. And the franchisee needs to be profitable because if they're not profitable, well, they're not going to open up a second one. They're not going to recommend it in the validation stage when you're going through and evaluating a franchise. One of the most important things you're going to do is talk to other franchisees. How is the support? How is the training? How are your numbers? If they can't validate, they can't grow. So they're in the royalty business. So that leadership team, and then the systems, the processes that the franchisor has developed. They've got the blueprint. They've got the game plan that if followed, you'll do well. And that takes us right back to the validation. That's what I'm listening for. When I'm validating, when I'm talking to franchise operators, I want to hear, and they can say it in a lot of different ways, but the underlying tone is follow the system and you're going to do well. That's what I'm paying for. I paid an initial franchise fee. I'm paying an ongoing royalty. And the lens that I evaluate, we just acquired another franchise last week. I look at it, where am I going to have my superior return on investment and return on time? And if the franchise cannot help me achieve that, I'll do it on my own. So people, process, and systems. It always comes back to those core fundamentals. And it's the same in franchising. Franchise is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, so there's an enormous amount of transparency that's required. But you have to know where to look and how to interpret. I had a conversation just earlier this week. I'm working with a guy, very successful executive, and pretty common profile, mid 40s. He's kind of executive level, and we're looking at 3 different franchises, and he had come across another franchise that he thought sounded interesting, so he wanted to look at it with me. And I wasn't familiar with this particular franchise. I know a lot of the franchises out there, but as I said, there's over 4,000 of them, and this one had about 80 units. I haven't heard of all of the franchises out there that have 80 franchisees. So I pull up the disclosure document, and you asked me how long it takes me to understand if a franchise candidate is viable. It takes me less time usually to look at a franchise, at least through that first blush, and determine is it solid. So I start looking at some of the core numbers. Well, their unit economics, they look pretty solid. Top line revenue. In this case, they're showing the seller's discretionary earnings, the SDE, and it all looks good. And then I went to their item 20, where it shows a 3-year running history of how many franchisees did they start the year with, how many did they add, transfers, which is a neutral event, somebody sold their business, terminations, ceased operations. Well, ceased operations, they failed. And there are different metrics. If it's a mature franchise, I want to see that number at 5% or less. For an emerging brand, statistically, it's maybe not as relevant. I'm looking at it situationally. Well, ceased operations, that number looked okay. Terminations was where the red flag came up. They had terminated over the last 3 years about 40% of their system. It's extraordinarily hard to terminate a franchisee. And there are valid reasons to terminate a franchisee. They're damaging the brand. They're cheating. They're diverting revenue to the same business, but outside of the franchise. But terminating a franchisee, that's a rare event. So they're playing a game. They're firing them before they can quit. They're trying to protect that ceased operations column because people understand what that is. And so as I pointed that out to him, he went, oh, okay. And so saved an enormous amount of time because we knew where to look. And instead of spending 3 or 4 weeks on it, we spent about 10 minutes. But those are the core fundamentals of a franchise when you're trying to understand, is this a solid franchise? And my personal belief, I think there are a lot of terrible franchises. 50% are, I'll use the technical term, I think they're train wrecks. And a lot of those are small franchises you'll never hear of, but some of them are large national brands. I think the middle category, let's say they're okay to they're good, probably the next 40%. So I think there's about 10% that are exceptional, that stand up to sophisticated due diligence. There's something more than buying a job. And sometimes that difference between good and great, it's just incremental. But that incremental difference can make a substantial difference if they're trying to really scale. In relative terms, let's say if I'm in a good franchise, using the exact same amount of investment, time, resources, maybe I can open up 2 of them. We bump it up to that exceptional, and we can maybe open up 4 instead of the 2. So it makes a huge difference.
Do you very often, what's the largest thing that people are trying to solve when they're evaluating if they're going to acquire a franchise? What are they trying to do? Are there so many segments that there's 10 different, or is there one that really stands out? I'm not saying it's the right reason, but what's really the reason when people come to you, you start working with them? Why do they want to do this?
I would say it probably falls into 2 categories. They're in some sort of a transition, or they feel one coming, or it's a diversification play. So let's take the person that's in a transition. They have a job, and it might be a $100,000 a year job. It might be $1 million a year job, but it's a job. And they've gotten to the point where either they've recognized that they're just selling their time. Income doesn't necessarily build wealth. And so they're frustrated with that. There's quite often some pain, travel, stress, uncertainty, or they've been, transitioned, let go, whatever we want to call it. I've been doing this for 20 years, this consulting, and it kind of runs in a cycle of what drives people in. Right now, it's AI. I mean, we can look around, we can see the different reports. The CEO of Ford thinks that 50% of all white-collar jobs are going to be replaced. So it's just study after study, and I'm seeing it. Over half of the people that I'm working with right now are threatened by AI. Either they're already out or they see it coming. So there's a pain point that they're trying to solve. They're trying to build real wealth. They're trying to build some equity. They're trying to take control. And we were talking earlier about those that do have the right makeup. There's so many talented people that if they were to take the same skill set, the same energy in building their own business that they spent years building others, they have a much different outcome. So that's type of what I typically see when they're in some inflection point. The diversification, that comes down to two categories also. I already own a business, and I'm at that continued diversification stage. I've got a couple of people right now that have built very successful businesses, and they enjoyed a liquidity event. They had a nice exit. What's next? And so they're exploring franchising as one of those possible alternatives. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are those that are already in a job, and sometimes they need to stay there. Sometimes they want to. I know a guy who is the number one franchisee in a pretty large system. He's had his job for 20 some odd years. He doesn't want to leave. He enjoys it. He's done quite well, on both sides. So that's normally what, there are the people that are coming to me, and why. And as I said, they're all different situations in life. Large operators, multi-unit franchise operators. One of the people that I've worked with, I work with a lot of people for years, and it's not on one business. It's on this continued diversification. Here's a good example. A young couple, they were, I think 38, 39 years old when we started. And this was about 5 years ago. They're in Alabama. They're both engineers, work for one of the airlines. And I didn't mention burnout when I was talking about, I just came off a call, and in his words, and this is somebody making mid six figures, he says, every day I feel like I got to get up and I'm reporting to an 1800s coal mine. He's burned out. But this, couple in Alabama, what their vision was for, to start a business, and to eventually, for him to work his way out of his job, and for her to be able to follow when it was reasonably possible. And they had about a 2-year time horizon for him to work himself out of his job. Put him into a really good, strong franchise, and good operator. They did a great job. He was actually able to leave his job about 6 months in. And over this last 5 years, they've acquired an additional 2 businesses. So they went from both having jobs to now they own 3 businesses. She could have left long ago. She's chosen not to. And that's really what we're trying to do, is put people in a position where they have more choice. They've got more options. She could leave tomorrow. She could stay another 10 years. Just talking with them a few weeks ago. She doesn't want to leave. She enjoys what she's doing. She knows she's got the flexibility to be able to do it. And that actually kind of reframed how she was looking at her job.
Yeah, I tell people often that the best part of getting to a place in life, this is similar to that on having options. The benefit to being wealthy financially is not like a Scrooge McDuck counting all the dollars and the piles of gold. That's not the benefit. And when you're poor, that's what you think it is. You think it's accumulation. It's actually getting to the place where you can actually live the life you want to. You actually have the choice. It's not about owning the $100,000 vehicle. It's that you can. And very often, the itch will be scratched by being able to when you get there, but you don't need to buy the thing.
It's so true. And I think it is being in a position where you can support the things that matter to us, the causes that matter, the people that matter. And these conversations that I have are often framed by what's happening to me right now.
Yeah.
And they're thinking in terms of days and weeks as opposed to months, years, decades. And sometimes, there's just the practical considerations. I need to put food on the table. I need to keep the lights on. And that comes back to having the financial capacity to be able to do that. But that's another misnomer. I think there's this perception that franchises cost millions of dollars, and some of them do.
Some do, right?
Yes, some do. But that's not where the day-to-day activity takes place. If we were to just divide this into two broad buckets, a franchise that requires brick and mortar and one that doesn't. If it has some sort of a physical brick and mortar presence, again, let's take the hundreds and hundreds of franchises that would fit into that category. If I were to look at the different types of sizes, but let's take where most of them are, it's a physical footprint of maybe 1,500 to 2,500 square feet. Everything that it takes to get the doors open, the franchise fee, build out the space, sign on the building, let's get to that ribbon cutting. $400,000 to maybe $800,000. That's the sweet spot. Are there some that are less than that? Yes. Are there some that are way more? Absolutely. But the day-to-day takes place in that range. General rule of thumb, you need about 20% of your own money in the deal. And then behind that, SBA loans, leased equipment, leverage of different sorts. And so now most of these franchises, the liquidity requirement, 100,000, 150,000, that's accessible to many. Franchises that don't have that brick and mortar component, we can operate maybe out of our home, an executive suite. It might even be like a small warehouse. From a practical 70,000 to 150,000. That's the sweet spot where that takes place. And I think another real common misperception, and I think that it's probably not intuitive, but I believe that there are franchises that are $150,000. Not I believe, I see it. Franchises that are $150,000 all in that financially outperform franchises that are $3 million. So there's not a direct correlation to the total investment and the total financial upside. It goes back to the strength of the franchise partner and your ability to execute inside that system.
Is there can we break this franchise idea versus bootstrapping and starting your own brand new brand? Can we just clearly identify kind of the average or normal, here's the exchange? Maybe you can't. I don't know what you're bound by in regulations. But is it kind of like, hey, you're going to give up 5 to 10% of sales for having this system?
Yes. So you're going to pay an initial franchise fee. So let's use you and I as an example. You have a business, you're very successful, and I like what you're doing. And I come to you and I say, I would like you to teach me everything you know about this business. And you look at me and you say, I don't think so. No, but then, I convince you to do it. And you say, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to charge you, $50,000, $60,000, whatever it is up front. That's the initial franchise fee. And then on an ongoing basis, I'm going to train you. I'm going to teach you everything I know. I'm going to provide you the technology, the systems, the processes, and I'm going to help you every step of the way, not just now, but 10 years from now. I'm helping you. I'm also going to plug you in to everybody else that I've helped in this business so that they can help you as well. And for that, I want a small piece. I want 6%. I want 8%, whatever it is. And where in the franchise world those royalties are, most of them are between 4 and 10%. It really varies by industry. And as a caution, is a 4% royalty better than a 10%? Not necessarily. I'm looking at how much am I taking out of the business? So, but for that initial franchisee, for that royalty, you bring me into this business and you help me accomplish things faster. How long does it take to get open? How long does it take to break even? How long does it take to hit all of these different mile markers? And going back to that lens that I was speaking to before, if I went out and I did that all on my own, compared to if I did it with you, where am I in my best situation? Return on investment, return on time, but let's also really consider, what's the likelihood that I succeed? What's the likelihood that I'm in business a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And that's one of the real helpful things about franchising, is because they've been there, they've made the mistakes. I don't have to make them again. And that, as I said, it's kind of entrepreneurship, but with guardrails. And I can see people ask me all the time, because there's a study that was done years ago, or not actually a study. It was published in an article and it became a fact. It was some reporter that made up a statistic that became fact. And it was something like 80% of all businesses fail and only 5% of franchises do. Patently false. Going back, the terrible franchises, they fail just as often as people going out and starting their own businesses. The strong franchises do very well. And we don't have to talk in just this general term. We can look at the individual franchise and their success record, looking in the item 20 of their franchise disclosure document.
Boy, that might be the best part, item 20. I can't believe our 45 minutes just flew by. It's like, what is going on? This is, it's been great to sit here and talk to you, but your business is FranChoice. This is Scott Jones with FranChoice. What do you, not just a general question at the end, but if somebody comes out of this and they're like, you know what, that was a good resource. I know I can buy all these franchises. I can open a coffee shop. I can open up a bar. I can open up a restaurant. We can have the service business. We can clean vents. I mean, they're everywhere. What's the best way for them to engage with you to start this process that you're willing to help them figure out? Is this something they should do? Where should they be placed? And I think the best resource that a Scott Jones sometimes can provide that we didn't touch on, we don't have time, is helping the ones figure out that maybe they shouldn't.
Whether you should or shouldn't, that's my goal, is to try to help you determine that. You can reach me, just go to Franchise Guide Group, franchiseguidegroup.com, and there you will find my contact information. There's a quiz that you can take, kind of see where you're at. There's different resources. And if you'll go to Franchise Guide Group, I'll personally meet with you for half an hour. And at the end of that half hour, you and I will both know if it makes sense to have a longer, more detailed conversation at a later date. And if so, most of the time I can take somebody and in 4 to 8 weeks, take you from knowing nothing about franchising, and if it would be a good fit, to getting to a point where you'll know one way or the other if a franchise is a viable solution for whatever it is you're trying to solve right now.
Awesome. Scott Jones, thanks for giving us your brilliance and your mind. This is a part of the mentorship that people get access to when they find guys like you and that what you specialize in. So thanks for coming on and sharing it with me, the audience, and for hanging out for 45 minutes.
I enjoyed it. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Absolutely.